At the stroke of noon on April 5th, 1968, the doors of St. Mary's Cathedral swung open with a resounding thud, and 300 clergy, with their finest vestments and robes fluttering in the wind in rows of 2 on 2, marched in utter silence down the busiest street in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, at the front of this procession, carrying the church's heavy processional cross, was the dean of the cathedral, an Episcopal priest named William Dimmock, and he was leading the group of clergy that day to City Hall to walk in the way of Jesus. Now, less than 24 hours earlier, Martin Luther King Jr. had been murdered across town in Memphis at the Lorraine Motel. And King had been working in the city the last several months with a sanitation workers' strike after 2 black workers had been accidentally crushed to death in a garbage truck as they took shelter from rain. Rightfully so, African Americans in Memphis and throughout the South took to the streets. They wanted fair wages, and they wanted a safer work environment, and they wanted to be treated like humans. Up until the murder of Dr. King, the riots and protests of the civil rights movement had yet to really penetrate the thick walls of Protestant churches here in the South. And this was especially true for St. Mary's Cathedral. St. Mary's was the most beautiful church in the city, and it served as the spiritual home of the mayor and the cultural elite. And Dimmock, as the dean, had been very careful not to rock the boat too much, until now. Now, in the wake of Dr. King's death, something had happened. Something had bubbled up inside of him and the others he was marching with, and now here he was, fully vested, extremely visible, and carrying the heavy processional cross down the busiest street in Memphis. 2 days later, in what was a total victory, the strike was settled in favor of the sanitation workers, and this was a tribute to the work and the sacrifice of Dr. King. And despite this victory, there was no celebration at St. Mary's Cathedral. In fact, in the weeks that followed, 60% of the congregation terminated their membership. This was Dimmock's punishment for speaking out against racial injustice. It was his punishment for breaking the subtle yet concrete code of white supremacy found even in the church. And it was Dimmock's punishment for truly living into God's transformative Trinitarian nature. Today, 52 years after the assassination of Dr. King and the clergy march in Memphis, we are still fighting the scourge that is racial injustice. We are still struggling to recognize the beauty and the wonder of God's creation that is present in all things and in each human being. And I find it only fitting that today, in the midst of all this protest we're seeing in cities around the world and around the country, I find it fitting that today we are celebrating Trinity Sunday in the church. Today is a day in which we celebrate the threefold nature of our God. A day in which we embrace again the knowledge that the God we worship is one, but with a oneness that flows and dances in a right relationship between 3 distinct persons. Now, you might be asking yourself, what, if anything, does the doctrine of the Trinity have to do with the civil unrest we see today? What does the Trinity have to teach us about the blood of our Black brothers and sisters, which calls to us from the ground? And how could this knowledge of the Trinity compel us to take up our cross like William Dimmock, to face down racial hatred and violence, or in the words of the prophet Micah, which we just sang, to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? To better understand the transformative power of the Trinity, the power that binds us together and leads us to face down hatred, I think it's best if we start at the beginning. Today's first reading was a long one, but it is one that is worth revisiting every so often, and I encourage you to go back to it later today and read it slowly and drink it in. It's beautiful. It is the first account of God's creating in the book of Genesis. And I just want to repeat that first passage that we read from that text today. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while the wind from God swept over the face of the waters. While it may not appear so at first glance, God's Trinitarian thumbprints are all over this passage. We see God, the author of all that is and will be, the first person of the Trinity at work on her masterpiece, which is our creation. But this person is not alone. She is accompanied by another. We know from the first chapter of the Gospel of John that Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, the Word made flesh, the Logos, was present at the beginning too. And with the Word was also the Spirit, the third person of the Trinity, the wind, or sometimes called the breath of God that swept over the formless void. Already in this short passage, we see the Trinitarian nature of God at work in putting together a creation that is wholly good. We saw that line over and over again in that first passage, that God was well pleased and that God saw it was good. We see that we are created in the image of this triune God, a fact that we would be wise to remember in times like these, when we are so divided and so fearful of the other. Yes, we must remember that we are made in the image of this triune God, a God in which the Father creates, a God in which the Son and the Word is present with us, praying with us and protesting with us, a God in which the Spirit moves and breathes in and amongst all things back to the Father and to the Son. And this has enormous implications if we take this seriously, that we are created in this triune image. This means that individual distinction and communal participation are not at odds with one another. And let me say that again. Individual distinction and communal participation are not at odds with one another. Rather, just as three within one can peacefully reside and work with one another, so can we live into that same image. Different individuals with different skin tones and different genders and sexualities and accents and stories and abilities in places like Dubai and North Carolina and San Mateo and everywhere in between, with each individual honored in the context of one. I know it is radical, but we worship a radical God that is somehow three and at the same time somehow one. And can you imagine how our world might be different if we embraced this radical Trinitarian mindset? It would be a world in which Black bodies are no longer seen as menacing or criminal. It would be a world in which every human being was seen as beloved. It would be a world in which the structures of systemic racism crumbled, giving way to a world which sees diversity and difference as something which strengthens our togetherness. The second reading we read today was the gospel passage, and it's Jesus' Great Commission. And the disciples are gathered together in Galilee, and they are told to go and to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. In other words, they are taught to go and spread the good news of Christ and the Trinitarian nature of God in a fractured world that is fraught with injustice and empire and inequality. He commissions them to go out and spread the ethos of sacrifice and servanthood that embraces individuals within the one. And that might sound inspiring and profound and somewhat fun, but let's be frank here. This commission is not easy for the disciples to hear, and the gospel tells us that some of them doubted. This mandate to spread a Trinitarian gospel will lead to death. Systems of empire will do anything to keep their power. This Trinitarian ethos led to the Christ crucifixion, It led to Dr. King's assassination. It led to a fractured church body in Memphis, Tennessee. And as we see today, it leads to millions in the street with tear gas, with riot gear, and brutality. Brothers and sisters, how will this commission to live in a Trinitarian way manifest in your life? And what part of your life are you willing to let die in order to fully embrace the Trinitarian calling? Perhaps by living into God's transformative Trinitarian nature that honors each individual within the one, perhaps we might live our lives more like Christ. We might feed the hungry. We might tend the sick. We might speak up on behalf of those who have no voice. We might even do something as simple and profound as carrying a cross down a busy street. However the Trinity may manifest in you, it is imperative that we as Christians act upon it. The goodness of creation, the unity of our world, and indeed our very souls depend upon it.